Hello, I am Richard with EV4U Custom Conversions, and welcome to another episode of the EV Answer Man. In this episode, we're going to discuss connectors and crimping, and this was a question that came to us from a YouTube viewer, and he said he has some difficulties with his crimping connections and wanted to know some information in regards connectors and crimping. So decided that we can't just do an episode on crimping and connectors. We're going to talk a little bit about wire. We'll talk about connectors and crimping, and then we'll also talk about how to secure the wire and the connectors. So hope that you learned something, and we thank you again for the questions. And so let's talk about wires and connectors. So first off, we're going to talk about wire. And wire comes in all different colors and sizes and so forth, but we'll talk first about the type of wire, stranded versus braided. A single strand wire, which I'll show you an example here. It's a sample of a single strand of wire, commonly found in residential construction. It is, a little more difficult to bend, but it holds its shape. Typically comes in this type of format, commonly called Romex. We actually do use this in automotive applications with our conversions, and that is we'll run this from the charge port to our safety interlock. And so we typically run an exterior grade Romex, but it really wouldn't matter in the vehicle. So that's two different types, or one type. This is a solid strand of wire. Comes in different sizes, and we'll talk about sizes in a moment. What we use the most in automotive applications is stranded wire. And probably a better view of that is this right here. This is some double-aught fine strand braided wire. And the nice thing about the fine strand is it allows it to be fairly flexible versus a heavier strand, which I didn't grab any, which is much more rigid. One of the reasons we want to use the stranded wire is that the electrons like to flow on the outside edge of the wire. And so with just this single strand, there's going to be more resistance per length and diameter of this wire than there would be of the same stranded, because the electrons like to flow on the outside of the wire, and so we allow them a less impeded path by offering them a stranded path. And so that's one of the reasons that this is used in automotive applications and in a lot of applications where we have a desire for lower resistance. Well, let's talk about wire size for a moment. What I showed you a moment ago, and let's see if I can separate two of these a little bit. There we go. This is number 16, and this is double aught. You can see quite a difference there. This is 6 gauge, number 6. A little bit of difference. And so, reason we use different size wire is in order to carry different loads. And so right here I've jotted down some common sizes. Actually, 18 gauge is used in automotive. And I didn't write that one down, but we've got 16 through 8 gauge, just to give you an idea that the 16 gauge wire is good up to 15 amps, a 14 up to 25 amps, and so forth. So the number 6 that I showed you a moment ago is going to be able to carry more than 100 amps, because number 6 or 6 gauge is heavier or a larger diameter than number 8. And so I take it you've noticed the pattern. The larger the number, the smaller the gauge of wire. And so 18 gauge wire is going to carry less than 15 amps. And so you want to use the right size wire for the intended purpose. And so you need to know the load that you're going to be carrying with that wire and size it appropriately. Something that we commonly use is what's called trailer wire. It's just simply wire that is together in 4 different colored wires that are, together like this and can be separated. The reason we like to use this, we use it for running wire from the front of the vehicle to the rear of the vehicle. So if you have different accessories, whether it be fans, a pump, all your low voltage runs, we'll use this. And we typically run 2 or 3 runs of this. So that gives us 8 to 12 wires, depending on the conversion and how many we're going to need. And you've seen photos and video of the engine compartments on the vehicle, and you'll see that we use this wire and it comes to a terminal strip. And this is easy to run the length of the vehicle. That's why we use it. Instead of having to pull 8 or 12 individual wires, this allows us to pull 3. So pulling these 3 together accomplishes what it would take, you could bundle 12 individual wires together and so forth. It's a little more of a hassle. So then what we do is we'll typically tie a knot in the one end or both ends after we pull it. And so we'll have one that's plain, one that's got a knot, and one that's got two knots, so that we can keep track of them at both ends. So they come color-coded already. Makes it easy. You could run individual wires with all individual colors. You could run, red and black, whatever you want to do. This is just a technique that we use. So we've talked a little bit about wire. Let's talk about connectors. And so I grabbed a few of the more common connectors that are used. This is a spade connector, a female. There's also a male counterpart. This is a ring or loop, kind of an open spade. This is just a different size female spade connector. And one of the things that you need to take note of is you need to buy the right size connector for the wire. And so I believe this is like 16 to 18. So they typically come sized for multiple gauges typically. Like this is, I believe, 10 to 12 gauge. And these are all, 16 to 18. And so these are, where you're terminating a wire, where it would be going to a terminal strip or a male connector, like on a relay or fuse block, that type of thing. And then, of course, there's just a million different variations. Here's one, again, female spade connector, but the wire comes out perpendicular. So it basically makes a 90. So the wire is going to come out like this instead of coming out like that. So whatever your need is, there's a connector for it. These are just a few of the thousands of different connectors available on the market. Another commonly used one is a butt connector. The butt connector just allows you to butt two wires. So you have a wire coming this way, wire coming this way. That's a butt connector. And we'll talk a little bit more about it in a moment. And again, like I said, there's just thousands of different varieties of connectors. Here's one that's nice to use, especially in situations where you have a lot of exposure to the elements. And this is actually what they call a marine grade connector. And it's nice for several reasons. One is that you put the wire in here and you can crimp it, and then you heat it with a heat gun, and there's solder in here, and it releases that solder. The solder, melts under the heat, and then this shrinks. This protective coating right here is actually heat shrink, and it shrinks around the wire, making a weather-tight connection. So there's instances where we use these on conversions so that we have a connector and a connection, wire to connector connection, that's not going to corrode anytime soon. So let me show you an example of making a connection here. Try to do this so that it shows up on camera and it's not just all me in the way here. So there's lots of different styles of wire cutters and strippers. And so here's an example of a wire stripper. And we just squeeze down and strip. And this is labeled for the different sizes. So this one goes from 20 to 10. Also listed in metric. Has some cutters right there. So anyway, we want to twist our stranded wire together like that. Then we would take our connector. This is an inline fuse. And that's a typical spot where we would use a butt connector. And so once we press the wire onto the connector, we use our crimping tool and give it a good squeeze. Now, you can under crimp it and you can over crimp it. I tend to squeeze things a little tight, so I got to be careful not to damage the connector. So, while we're talking about these, let's take a look. We showed you the one style of wire stripper. Let's take a look at another style. It's a style that I use a lot. And what it does is it's an automatic stripper, or actually semi-automatic. Anyway, you put the wire in place like that and you squeeze it, and what's going to happen is it's going to grab the wire, and then it's going to have these two jaws on this side are going to strip it. So one side grabs and holds the wire, the other side strips it. And there you have it. So with the crimpers, there's lots of different crimping tools. Here's one. And this is common. It's got the stripper built in, and then it's got crimping, and it's got different positions for different size of wire. This kind of has a flatter crimp to it. This is where the wire goes, or the connector, and you can see it crimps like that. And so let's see if we can see that crimp style. So it's without any wire in it, but it crimps that way. Here's another style. And you can see it has kind of a rounded portion and then a pointier portion that goes in. What I like to do with that style, we'll go ahead and attach it on this wire that we stripped. If I can stay in the view of the camera here, I keep wandering off. Is if we look at this, this is made from one piece, and so there's a seam where they've taken this flat piece of metal, it's stamped out, and then it's rounded. And so with this style of crimper, I don't want this piece going in the seam. I want it to go on the opposite side. So I will set it like this. So it will go then on the flat side. Put my wire in, and that's about where you want. You want the wire to just come out of the end of your connector. And give it a squeeze. And there we have it. Very strong connection. Can't pull that apart. It's going to hold. And so that then could be attached to like our terminal strip or whatever. This then, being an inline fuse holder with fuse, could go from a power source and then our accessory or whatever item we're powering could be connected there. Here's a couple other style connectors. This is one that we use a lot of times. We have a fuse block and you have more than one item coming off that particular fuse. We just stick that on there, and we've taken a single connection and doubled it. Don't like to put too many on there. You don't want to overload a circuit. And so that brings us to fuses in general. Well, let me back up. I got ahead of myself there. Another common connector is this. You'll see these a lot on trailers or trailer lighting applications where people put in the connector for trailer lights. I hate these things. They're designed so that you can take an existing wire that's in place, and that wire goes through like that. And then you have another wire, for instance, the trailer connector that you're wiring up, and it goes in here. So now you have the existing wire and your new wire. And you just take some pliers crimp that down, and what that did was it then pushed that piece of metal into the wires. You now have a connection. This folds down, locks into place. Reason I don't like these is they tend to corrode fairly rapidly because they are kind of open to the weather. The other is that this connector itself, they dry out and get brittle, they break. This opens up, then connection goes bad. These are just notorious for bad connections. They're little time bombs. You first put it in, they work real good. They go in quick and easy, quick fix. I recommend it only for temporary use. Typically when I connect trailer lights, I solder them in place, put heat shrink over it. I do it one time, end of story. But thought I'd share that with you. They are very common. Don't use them on your conversion. If you have to use it on your trailer lights, not on your conversion. So before we talk about fuses, let's talk about heat shrink. And then of course, electrical tape. Now, again, I have biases that we're going to talk about. I'm not a big fan of electrical tape. Electrical tape is good in certain applications. If you've got a junction box in your house and you got the solderless nut on there and you want something extra, you can put some electrical tape on it. But in the automotive world, where we have exposure to the elements and extreme temperature changes, instead of taking this tape and say we wanted to wrap it around this, you know, it just, you know, I got to admit I do use it on occasion for certain things, but on the conversions you're not really going to see too much electrical tape on our jobs. What we use is heat shrink. And heat shrink is exactly what the name implies. You put it over the connector and your wire, and then with heat, it's going to shrink. So using your heat gun, show this. Only takes a second. There we have a nice, very tight, very clean that's permanent. Much better than the tape. So it's really not any more time or hassle to do it, but that's the way to do it. Here's an example on your traction pack side where we've taken your lug, simply stripped the insulator off of the wire, put this on, crimp it, put the heat shrink on, and you have a nice finished product. So talking about the double op, which is what's most commonly used, there are a couple ways again to do it. Here's a common one, inexpensive. I don't really like these, but you put the connector in. Of course, your wire would be in here also. And then you smack the heck out of it with a hammer, and that will crimp it. Another way to do it is with a hydraulic crimping tool. So you put it in there, and just under a little hydraulic cylinder, puts that baby under pressure, crimps it down. Nice to use. A good one like we have at the shop, they run over $300. We also use these little ones. They're 60 or 70 bucks from Harbor Freight. Not as nice as the big one, but the price is right. And if you're only doing one conversion, that might be a good choice. Instead of investing 300 bucks on something you're only going to use once, 70 bucks is a little easier to swallow. Or you can go this way. I don't know how much these are, $14 or something. These are real cheap. You can go this way. Make sure you wear eye protection whenever you're pounding on something with a hammer, so that something doesn't fly off and get you in the eye. All right, let's now talk about, we've talked about the wire and connectors, the tools used, wire strippers, crimpers, heat shrink, electrical tape, wire size, so forth. Well, something else I thought we'd talk about at this same time would be fuses, because it's an integral part of this equation. Anytime you're running a wire, you want to have a fuse in there. So it can originate from a fuse block like this. So you have your fuses here and you have your individual circuits going out. And you want to have the circuit sized along the entire circuit. In other words, if your load is 10 amps, then you want to have a wire like a number 16, which is good to 15 amps. And so you don't want to have a fuse that exceeds that of the wire. So we'd want to use no larger than a 15 amp fuse. We want that to be the weak link. That's what a fuse is. It's the weak link. And so they come in lots of different styles. There's the inline style like this. There's the inline style that takes the round glass style. This is the spade style fuse. This is one that will use the main power going to the battery for all of our unswitched accessories. And so this would then go to a bus bar or something that everything else then came off of, and this would be unswitched 12 volts. This type of fuse block we typically use on our fused 12 volts. So this would come from an ignition source, would go here, and then we have 6 sub-circuits that can come off of there. They make these different sizes also. So you want to have a fuse that's the right size, you want to have the wire that's the right size, and the connector that is the right size. So let's quickly talk about something else that you come across that's fairly common, and that is 2 wires going into the same connector. So let's take a look there. So now, instead of, and we don't do this a lot, but there are instances where we do it, where we'll have a connector and we want 2 wires coming out of that connector. So this will represent our 2 wires right here. When we do that, I typically strip it a little bit longer than I would normally. And I'll show you why in a second. So we strip our wire. And the reason I do that is that we're going to take the 2 wires and we're going to twist them together. And in doing that, we're going to lose a little bit of length. So I've twisted the 2 wires together. I'm going to need a connector that's sized appropriately so that those 2 wires would fit in there. And then I take the correct setting on my crimper and give it a good crimp. Now I have 2 wires in one connector. There it goes. So those are the most common scenarios, at least that I can think of right now, for connectors and a conversion. So we've shown you that. Here's an example. I'll just grab this. We didn't do this, but this was something that came off of something. Just shows an example of, here's a spade connector with a loop on the other side, and they've put heat shrink on them. So just another example. So the other thing that, we've talked about fuses, wires, connectors. Well, then there's a little part in it, and it's important to me for a couple reasons. And one is, when you run your wire, you want to run the wire in such a way that it's not going to get snagged on something and create a problem. And whenever you run through sheet metal, you want to use a grommet. So the grommet would go in place, then you run your wire through it. And depending on the diameter of the wire and the number of wires would dictate the size of grommet that you would use, the size of the hole and the size of the grommet. So there's that. Then you also want to secure it. You don't want the wire bouncing around, rubbing on things. And so we use what's called zip ties or wire ties, whatever you want to call it. Make sure you get good ones. Cheap ones don't last. Use it to secure the wire to something that's not going to chafe against it or anything else. Bundles groups of wires together. Looks nice. Then don't leave the excess on there. That doesn't look good. Just take some dikes, cut it nice and close. If you leave it out too far, it'll snag you and cut you. I've busted many a knuckle on a wire tie. So that's part of it. We now making our wires secure and look good. Then to finish it off, you can take some split loom. And it's exactly what the name implies. It's a loom, and it's got a split in it, and allows us to take and put our wire into here. And you just continue on as far as you want it to go. And they make fancy ends for the loom and everything else. I mean, you can, whatever you want to spend. I don't typically put the fancy ends on them. But anyway, there's the loom. Then they also make, accessories where I can now take this loom and attach it. This is not the proper size for this size of loom, but this could then be attached to something, holds that in place. It's both secure and it looks nice. And that's what you want to do. You want to make a conversion that is going to be nice and simple and safe and reliable, but that looks nice also. And it's really very easy to do. Just take your time and do things in a systematic, methodical fashion. So I mentioned there's another way to do this, and that is to solder. And you can solder the connectors on using a soldering iron or a soldering gun. So you would tin the wire, that's melt the solder onto the wire, put your connection on, then you want to heat the connector and wire together and then apply the solder, and it will flow when the heat is, you have the proper amount of heat. After it cools, you can put your heat shrink on, and then you have a nice finished product, one that's going to last a very long time without any problems. I've heard many a time people had problems because they had a bad connection, and it was because of a poor connector. And when you use this type like we talked about, I can almost guarantee that day will come, and it will come sooner than you want. So I think that's everything I was going to touch on this episode. We talked about the tools, we talked about wire, fuses, connectors, crimping. So this is just an overview. If you want more in-depth information, contact us at info@evforyounow.com, and we'd be glad to either answer the question via email, over the phone, or with a video response, depending on what the circumstances are, so that you have your question sufficiently answered and can do what you need to do. There's one other thing I'd like to share with you, and that is, so I just want to remind you again about our video. It's called How to Convert from Gas to Electric, the complete video. It's about 7 hours of video, and it goes through all of your components, explains their use, how to size them and make choices to where your components are compatible. Gives you the big picture understanding of a conversion, so that you would know all the things that we've talked about on our YouTube videos, plus a lot more. It's actually designed to give you the information to do your own conversion with confidence and get it right the first time. And so you can see what we talked about. Here's connectors. Connectors on the shunt, connectors to the motor, connectors to our heat switch on the motor. These are male and female spade connectors. Allows us to disconnect at that point so that we can remove the engine without having to cut the wire. And so connectors are our friends. Over here, probably in the dark on camera, terminal strip with a number of connections, and here's one extra that wasn't used. We always like to do that. We like to run more than we need, so in the future if we need it, it's there. The wire's already run up front. And so we talk about all that type of thing in the video so that you'll have all the tools necessary to do your own. So look for it. It's on the upper right hand portion of our website on the home page. How to Convert from Gas to Electric, the complete video. And with that comes 60 minutes of free consultation. That's a $60 value, as well as schematics and some other printed literature that's included with it. It comes on a flash drive. It's, I believe, about 5 or 6 gigabytes. And just want to let you know that we have that available. Thanks again for watching. Hope to see you next time.